And good morning, and thank you very much indeed for taking some time out of schedules which, to say the least, are full of more immediate distractions at the moment. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tim Gardam, the Chief Executive of the Nuffield Foundation, and I'm really here to welcome us all. We're a mixture. We have here our grant holders and researchers. We have some of you from the worlds of policy and practice, which are really our critical audiences, the audiences for the grants we fund, some of our partners, and then Nuffield trustees and staff from across our teams and our research centres, ADA, the Family Justice Observatory, and the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. And in the course of today, I hope we can think through what might be our priorities that we should try to capture in a new strategy which we plan to launch around the turn of the year. And then, out of what we talk about today, we can develop those projects that can define our purposes in the coming years, because after all, between now and 2030, we have about £130 million to spend, which is much less than Anna's got to spend, but even so. So to start us off, I'm simply going to offer us a bit of context. I want to explain why we've given this conference its title, Our Insecure Society, Risks Across the Life Course, and then just reflect a bit on how Nuffield's future agenda might be framed to reflect this increasingly uncertain world. Because our horizon has always been the medium and the long than the blinkered one of politics. So we keep a deliberate distance from the election, though we have funded some excellent projects designed to shine some light into the fog of the campaign. But Nuffield research invariably goes deeper into the grain of society than the shortcuts of political debate allow. And at our best, we're empirical, disinterested, and impatient of ideology. Yet we also have a sympathetic and granular understanding of the increasing diversity of lives across the United Kingdom. And this, I hope, keeps us grounded in what Ruskin, with that enviable Victorian mixture of eloquence and lucidity, called the rough work of the open world. So standing back from whatever government's in power, Nuffield's distinctiveness, I think, lies in funding independent analysis of the most intransigent questions we face. Work that will bring clarity out of complexity and can be made use of in the worlds of policy and professional practice. The Nuffield pound is well spent if it directly or indirectly improves lives, individually and collectively. Now, the foundation was set up 80 years ago with the object to advance social well-being. And social well-being, for my money, the best description of the goal that keeps us true to our purposes. 7 years ago, we published a strategy that revisited our original objects and reviewed how they should meet the needs of a society that's changed out of all recognition since 1944. And we set out, we said, to engage with and to understand the significance of new trends and disruptive forces, social, demographic, technological, and economic, that are changing the structures and context of people's lives. And we launched that strategy at a conference in 2019, and we said then we'd hold another conference after 5 years. Disruptive forces have accelerated on all fronts. There's increasing anxiety about social and geographic polarization. Rapid demographic change in terms of both age and ethnicity has made intergenerational and cultural questions even the more marked. And a revolution in digital technologies and AI is shaping the future of work and affecting personal relationships and mental health. And AI, of course, may have an unquantified capacity for delivering public benefit and re-engineering our public services as they falter, but it's also a factor in eroding trust in information and in public institutions as a myriad of social networks replace the civic networks that we these technologies by powerful individuals is both challenging the role of the state and the norms of corporate governance. And alongside all this, the economic stagnation has persisted for more than a decade as geographic inequalities have become the prism through which we look at a public sphere where less and less seems to work. Now, in our 2019 conference, we also launched our most ambitious project, the IFS Deaton Review on Inequalities. And 5 years on, it's worth revisiting what Sir Angus Deaton said then. And he argued this: well-being cannot be considered only in terms of material well-being, what he called the Chicago heresy. The experience of 21st century inequality may not be defined in financial terms so much as by the loss of status, dignity, and self-worth, and meaningfulness, losing the basic support structures of life. Inequalities manifest themselves in differences in health, education, gender and ethnicity, and democratic participation. And Deaton's perceptiveness was more than evident the following year in the inequalities and points of fracture that were revealed by the COVID pandemic. But he went on to challenge the research culture for not always measuring up to what was required to understand what's happening to the world. And he said, research that can address successfully these new interleaved challenges to social well-being will require different methods and a greater interdisciplinary range. In the face of such complexity, disciplinary silos are a real catastrophe. Economics must engage with demography, history, sociology, psychology, and epidemiology. There also needs to be a preparedness to think more broadly if we are to engage successfully with these broad questions. And he cautioned an emphasis on randomized control trials as the dominant research tool can limit and define questions too locally and too narrowly. We've tried to respond to Deaton's critique. Britain's changing demography and its implications is a large theme of this conference. And our strategic fund grants have largely embraced the interdisciplinarity he called for. We've underscored the need for intersectional approaches to reflect the multiplicity of experiences and contexts that shape people's identities in an increasingly diverse society. And this intersectionality will be evident, I hope, in a new Nuffield programme, which we're calling Racial Diversity UK, because this will address the future demography of a Britain shaped in large part by its Commonwealth heritage, and will examine why some differential racial outcomes persist, whilst other racial disparities have notably closed. Sometimes, disciplinary silos in policy research are mirrored in government. And 2 years ago, Kerry Oppenheim's Changing Face of Early Childhood programme forged connections between individual research grants of ours on different policy aspects of the first 5 years of life in Britain today, and so helped breach some of those silos. And we now intend to do the same with a second programme, also led by Kerry. It's called Grown Up, with a question mark, and will navigate the increasingly risk-strewn transitions to adulthood among the current 14 to 24-year-old generation. And this is the subject of our second conference session today. But since Angus Deaton's lecture, further disruptions in areas normally far beyond Nuffield's concerns make 2019 feel a very long time ago. After all, this was before Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, before the new assertiveness of China and the gradual decoupling of a global economy that was the basis for growth over 2 generations. The intractable conflict in the Middle East has become part of the polarizing antagonisms in Western society. And beyond this lies the inexorable acceleration of climate change and all its implications, including migration. Now, these wider global disruptions may initially appear far beyond Nuffield's research interests, but they do fundamentally affect them. The Nuffield Foundation was created at a time when our society was rebuilding itself after 2 terrible world wars. It was an era of confidence in institutions, from the UN and the IMF to the European Community, and in Britain, the welfare state. There was a framework of international law, trust in the effectiveness of the state to drive technological advance for the public good and to provide universal welfare. Today, by contrast, we face a world of dynamic 21st century technologies, decaying 20th century social institutions, and the return of 19th century geopolitics. It's not a great combination. It's called, to my mind, John Donne's account of the world at a similar moment of political, social, and scientific upheaval in the early 17th century. The new philosophy puts all in doubt. 'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone. So we must constitute a coherent society in this changed environment. Our agenda, previously defined by inequality, is morphing into one which will be defined by insecurity, and hence the title of this conference. Now, Nuffield's interest will remain focused on the UK and on the lives of individuals, families, and communities. Inequalities will remain a salient question, but that agenda can't be narrowly based on past assumptions. We need to examine on what terms and to what degree it will be even possible to secure social well-being against these global tides of uncertainty. We will maintain our three core areas of interest in education, welfare, and justice, though we should do more to recognize the connections between them. Our research invariably returns to the impacts of wider forces on the domestic space in people's lives, especially the impact on the vulnerable, the youngest and the oldest, but also those who at different points in their lives are just trying to hold it all together. And that's why education has always been the core interest for Nuffield, because it, above all, can deliver for each generation, whatever their background, the opportunities and skills that enable not only the flourishing of individual lives, but also their contribution to enhance the lives of others. And this will be a theme, I think, running through all our sessions today. One mark of a successful society must be how it supports those most in need. But we should also address the wider contours of social well-being through research that seeks a more inclusive understanding of what makes a society work as a whole. We need to ask, what is the relationship between a caring and a productive society, between families, communities, and labour markets and enterprise? What are the models for furthering productivity, realising people's skills and talents to leverage innovation and economic prosperity? I think this has resulted in our increasing interest in the importance of place, the social geography of belonging, if you like. At the same time as the digital society offers endless connections across cyberspace, geographic inequalities and cultural diversity have intensified our sense of identity located in where we are. So, on what terms can we build an inclusive and prosperous society in the context of our changing demography and ways of life? That's the broad focus of our first session this afternoon, families, work and care. And the place justice has played alongside education and welfare as one of our three core areas is because the justice system underpins the legitimacy of our welfare system. It's the point of adjudication between the individual and the state. The Nuffield Family Justice Observatory has arguably been our most incisive innovation because it's identified pathways to less damaged lives for the vulnerable families and young children caught in the care system. But if access to and trust in the justice system breaks down, then wider public trust in a just society breaks with it. The problems of institutional trustworthiness, the efficacy of public services, and the perceived legitimacy of the state, or lack of it, these are the subjects of our final session this afternoon. And Nuffield has always been concerned with that interplay between science and technology and social change. Lord Nuffield himself had that mid-20th century C.P. Snow vision of the scientist as the guardian of social progress. The Nuffield Council on Bioethics and the Ada Lovelace Institute both now address the social and ethical issues that need to be resolved in policy terms if we're going to harness the exponential advances in data science, in AI, in genetics and neuroscience for the public good. Whenever I go to an Ada meeting or to a bioethics meeting, I get a glimpse of how the world is going to be. So, in conclusion, I hope you can see why we have made risk and insecurity the themes of this conference. We've got to rescue the idea of risk from the deadening calculus of the corporate risk register. We need a fresh understanding of what risks we'll need to accept, what risks we must mitigate, and how these choices can be negotiated collectively to secure a prosperous and tolerant society, both diverse and coherent. Nuffield will always relate research evidence to the inevitably tough trade-offs and difficult choices that govern any policy decision and its implementation. That's the difficult part. It's why we link research to policy and practice. It is, in the end, a question of what we, as a society, can agree to want. And that brings me to our keynote speaker. Sir Andrew Dilnot will be well known to all of you. His commission on the funding of social care for the elderly, in I think 2011, set out how government might address one of the most intractable problems that an ageing society faces, And since then, he's shown tireless tenacity over more than a decade, not letting the argument drop as successive administrations have just tried to dodge it. He's been chair of the UK Statistics Authority, is a former trustee of this foundation, and is warden of Nuffield College in Oxford, where he hosted our first conference. In contrast to those in public life who use numbers as rhetoric, Andrew has an unparalleled knack of giving data and statistics a moral clarity that forces us to acknowledge the hard choices we may prefer to avoid and to make judgments based on what the data tell us. Andrew told me he wanted to take this opportunity to stand back and consider what we make as a society. I asked him for a title. He suggested, "What do we want?" So I now invite Andrew to talk to us, and then Ravi Gurumurthy and Anna Vignoles will respond. Andrew.
Thank you, Tim. It's really lovely to be here. It's lovely to see you all. It's great to have an opportunity to think about these things which are unbelievably important. I do love a number, and there's going to be quite a lot of data flying across the screen. My defense is that it's full of enlightenment, as I'm sure you all agree. So here we are. We're stuck in the middle of another election. I've probably both done about 10 elections in our professional lives, and they keep rolling round. I spent the first 22 years of my working life working at the IFS, an institution I love inordinately, enormously, which I think has done great good. One of the constant refrains of what the IFS says about an election, and I think I can first remember us saying it in the 1983 election, was there are actually choices that have to be made, and that public spending and taxation can't be thought of on their own. And there are some pressures which were visible even back in the early 1980s that meant that there was a strong likelihood that some of the large areas of public spending were going to grow more quickly than the economy as a whole, the paying of pensions and healthcare. 40 years later, we have debates in elections that still seem to imagine that they can dodge those kinds of choices. Looking at the discussions that we'll have about fiscal policy in this election, you could spend quite a long time looking for a mature debate and probably failing to succeed. But I want to stand a bit back from that, because if we just say again, oh, to all of the parties, for goodness sake, grow up and have a sensible debate about that, it doesn't seem very likely going to make a difference. What's the underlying thing that means that we can have as a society such a futile, sterile debate? Well, the line I'm going to run to is that's because I think we've got stuck in a completely wrong conception of what living standards are. And this thought first occurred to me a couple of years ago when there was a story on one of the news websites, I think it was the BBC, but I can't be sure, which the headline of which, and of course headlines are often not ideal, the headline of which was something like latest fiscal event, I can't remember whether it was a budget or an autumn statement, means living standards set to continue to decline. And then something like the first sentence of the second paragraph said, what this fiscal event has done has increased taxes to allow public spending to increase. Well, in what possible, I mean, there is a world where increasing taxes to increase, that's a world where the public sector is very bad at transforming money from out of the pockets of all of us into public services. But that wasn't the point that was being made. The point that was being made was that living standards are post-tax income. Effectively, and I think you'll now, I hope after today, you'll notice this in much public debate, we behave as though there is no value being created to our living standards by public spending. And that's a very, very curious state of affairs. And let me emphasize at this point, this is not a left-right comment that I'm making. There's a perfectly plausible right-wing version of the world where we do much less through state activity than we do in the UK, and much more through direct private sector activity. The US is an example of that. Perfectly plausible. Do we, for example, think that imagine a world where the demand for healthcare is going to double over the next 20 years? That's the world that we live in, because there are so many people of, well, Tim and my generation. The demand for healthcare is going to double in this country and in the US. In the US, much of that doubling will take place within the private sector. In the UK, much of it will take place within most of it will take place within the public sector. Would we want to say that living standards have increased as a result of that in the US, but haven't increased in the UK? That seems completely bonkers. So what's going on here? Well, let me start back in 1981, when you have to imagine a very young version of me, slightly taller, almost identical, I'm sure. Although you have to imagine dungarees and a T-shirt, which was my uniform then. So back at the IFS in the early 1980s, it was just becoming possible to do data. And we were very excited. We had a PC, which had 8-inch floppy disks, and which took about 8 hours to do something you can do in 3 seconds on your phone these days. And we were analyzing family expenditure survey data, what's now become subsequently became the since the year of data that I was looking at was the 1977 year of data. There were 7,198 households in the survey, although 3 of them had been, I don't mean morally, I mean the data had been corrupted. And this was part of a vision that John Kay, the then director of the IFS, extraordinary visionary person, had, which he described as a thing called his distribution project. It was funded by the Gatsby Foundation. And what John wanted us to do was go beyond the then straightforward to think about the distribution of all incomes, the distributional effect of all taxes, including taxes on companies and capital goods, and to think about the distribution of all consumption, not just private consumption, but public consumption in the form of not just health and education, which are private goods publicly provided in the UK, but also the genuine public goods, the security services, the police services, defence, road networks, sewage network, actually do the whole thing, the whole economy, not as so often falling into the trap of looking just at the simple and easy bits of the economy. Well, we started by thinking, well, let's see if we can get a description of the household income distribution. So this is the data I lovingly worked on, the 1977 data, and this is the shape of the income distribution, numbers of individuals up the side, pounds per week along the bottom, all in 2013-14 prices. So honestly, this was really difficult in 1981. Now it's terribly easy. Then we had 2 wonderful young members of staff join us, Alyssa Goodman, who may even be here today, and Steve Webb. And we set them the task of doing this every year from 1961 to the present day. And in 1994, they published it. And this was, I thought, an extraordinary thing, because it meant that for the first time ever, we had a time series of consistent cross-sections of the income distribution. There's the 1961 chart, and now we'll just roll through 1960. See, not very much is happening. It's not changing its shape very much. It's on the whole moving somewhat to the right as we get better off, but nothing much is happening. Indeed, income inequality, measured this way, doesn't really change through the 60s or even through the 70s. Wake up and pay attention. We're just coming to the early mid-80s. And look, all of a sudden, something extraordinary is happening and astonishing, spreading out of the income distribution through the second half of the 80s. Then we go back to the 1990s, and it all gets more boring again, and nothing much happens, and nothing much happens throughout the 1990s. We get a little bit better off. Same thing goes on through the 2000s. We get a bit better off, but the fundamental shape of the income distribution doesn't change, and we're going to stop at 2013 because that was how far we got when I last made this set. So there we are in 2013. So that's 1963. That's 2013. That is a big, big structural shift in the distribution of post-tax, post-Social Security income. That's a big change. In 73 and 83, and then look, we get what is, for economists, pretty exciting. I don't mean in a good or bad way, I just mean big change, a massive shift in the distribution of income, and then again, not much happens from 93 on. So the second half of the 1980s were an astonishing period of change, and that's pretty important. I cannot tell you how delighted I was when Alyssa and Steve finished this work, which had involved going back to the Public Records Office at Kew to collect some households data from early years of the FES, and then taking the computer tapes to Sainsbury's in the East End, because that was the only place where they had a mainframe that could read these old... It was a fabulous piece of work. It's massively incomplete. So what this tells us about is the distribution of post-tax income. But it doesn't tell us anything about the impact of taxes on companies. It doesn't tell us anything about the impact of consumption out of wealth, so housing consumption, which is an incredibly important part of our well-being. It doesn't tell us anything about the effect of healthcare or education or the police or our justice system or our road network. So it tells us only about a part of what's going on. It's unbelievably important and brilliant work, but it's only a part of what's going on. Well, it really, really does, because why were we interested in income? Well, we were only really interested in income as a proxy for consumption. We don't much care about the distribution of income, and one of the things that is closest to that, although not by any means all of it, is consumption. Is it big? Well, I've had such fun over the last 10 days. I see John Pullinger here. John will empathise with this. There may not be many other people here who do. I've been deep in the national accounts. You have no idea how much fun it is if you're of a particular kind of a person. So here are expenditure components of GDP going back to 1948. So 1948 on the left, 2022 on the right. The brown line at the top is total expenditure as a share of overall GDP. And so you can see it starts the period at about 90%, falls about 80 in the middle, is about 80 now. What's the blue line? Well, the blue line is household direct expenditure as a share of GDP. So this is when we buy a loaf of bread or a car or some clothes. There's quite a big gap, and it's growing. And the distributions that I've just shown you are basically the distributions of the income that are used to pay for the blue line. Well, what's the rest? What is this gap that is growing? Well, part of it is this grey line at the bottom, government expenditure on private consumption. So this is the health service and education, social care, free childcare. And you see it starts off at a bit less than 10% and ends up at close to 20%. That's quite a large share of our GDP, which are nowhere in those distributions that I showed you, are nowhere in the public and political discussion of living standards. This is government collective expenditure, so defence, police forces, our justice system, our public health system. Those are incredibly important features of our lives, of our well-being. But when we talk about living standards, when our politicians talk about living standards, they're not on view. This is gross domestic fixed capital formation, so investment, so the bit that takes the brown line at the top and makes it up to 100%. And there's a whole story there, but we're not going to get into that today because we haven't got time. Does all of that matter? Well, the two items of government consumption on behalf of households add up to more than £500 billion a year. They're nearly £10,000 per person per year. That's pretty important. If we're not thinking about those at the same time that we're thinking about living standards, then we're in a terrible pickle. So why don't we? Well, because they're much more difficult. So it's quite easy to work out what the value of my shoes is when I buy them, because there's a very active market out there, and I go and I buy them for what they're worth. It's quite easy to do that with a loaf of bread. What about healthcare? What is healthcare worth to us? Do we really want to say that healthcare is worth how much of it we consume. And that seems bonkers, because that's suggesting that healthcare is only worth something to you if you're ill. Healthcare is a classic example of a risk pooling activity. So that something at the heart of this conference today is thinking about risk. Well, healthcare is all about risk. We really want not to consume it, but we want to know that if we need it, it will be there. Is its value to us just the average amount that's spent on people of our age and gender? Well, that's one way of thinking about it, but in fact, I think it's probably the wrong way of thinking about it, because most of us would be willing to pay much more than that. Insurance is a very funny commodity, and some insurance we buy privately, insurance for our cars or insurance for our houses. And we moan when the price goes up. We moan when the price of anything goes up. But if we actually asked ourselves the question, how much is this worth to us? I think in many cases we'd find it was worth more to us than the premium that we have to pay. The reason we can end up with those premium is competitive markets. But in the context of the things that in this country government does for us, working out how to value them is genuinely difficult. There's been some great work done at the ONS. Honestly, our estimates of the productivity of public service output are better in the UK than in many other countries. But measuring the value of the output in terms of services done is not quite. And one of the things I want most strongly to say is that I really hope over the next 10 or 20 years we will do a much better job as a research community of interrogating that question and working out what the answer to that is in a way that allows us to integrate it into the kinds of slides that I showed you at the beginning. It is really important, and it's really big. It's really, really big. It's also much more difficult than the things we concentrate on. That just puts all of them on the same slide. Now, one of the things I've experienced over the last few days looking at the national accounts is that I think there's something funny going on with the volume measures going backwards. And I've had fabulous conversations with former colleagues at the ONS who are doing a great job on this. All of that means that I think on the whole, it's better to look at the current prices numbers. The trouble with the current prices numbers is if you look at that, then household consumption is something like 200 times as high as it was in 1948. Government expenditure for the private sector directly, so health and education, is something like 400 times as high, and government collective expenditure, public goods, is about 200 times as high. So that's not terribly easy to interpret, because we're not good once numbers get big, but I think you do need to work with these current prices things. So what I've done is move to shares. So what this chart shows you is from the national accounts, government-funded consumption as a share of household-funded consumption. So you see it begins in 1948 at 20% of household-funded consumption, and now it's significantly above 30% of household consumption. It's big and it's growing. The principal driver of that has been this government-private consumption. So I'm using government-private to mean health, education, that kind of thing, the things that could be provided by the private sector but are provided by the government in the UK. That's gone from 10% to 20%. It's nearly doubled. And I promise you, either that's going to go up over the next 20 years very significantly, or there's going to be a big shift of that into the private sector. One or other of those things is going to happen, because we are going to consume more healthcare without any question. You can see this brown line is what's happened to the collective, the genuine public goods. That stayed rather stable. Value to all of us in our living standards of the defence services, or the international security services, or the police, or our justice network is. But the suggestion that means they don't have any value is clearly bonkers. And something I think we all might well want to worry about is that this line has been relatively flat. And as we look at our sewer networks, but also quite possibly the capacity of our justice system, the capacity of our international security services, or the police, those are things that might genuinely worry us, and we don't have them integrated into our mainline political discourse or how we think about living standards. Perhaps in questions, but this gives you 5-year average 5-year rolling average growth rates for these things. And the only thing I'll point out, so household direct, so me buying my shoes, is in blue. Government private, so health and education, is in grey. You'll notice that basically until the late 1970s, on average, government spending is growing more quickly than private spending. From the late 1970s till the late 1990s, the reverse on average is true. Direct private spending is growing more quickly than public spending. Since then, we had a period, which the period of the 97 to 2010 Labour government, when we saw public spending growing quickly again, and now we're not quite sure, and the stuff at the end is all COVID. That deducts one from the other. So here is the period in the middle when public spending is not growing very quickly. Here is the pre-war, post-war, sorry, and there is the Labour government. We could spend more time on that, but let's not, as I say, in the interest of... But you might well say, but all of this is aggregate, Andrew, and we know that you really love distributional data, microdata. Isn't that what we should be looking at? And the answer to that is, well, yes, although I think the aggregate tells us an incredibly important story, which is that there's a quarter of our economy that makes a massive contribution to all of our well-being that is complicated, that we're just basically ignoring in our macro debates. Well, if we'd done what John Kay had wanted us to do all those years ago, I had a conversation with him a month ago about this, then we'd be able to answer that question. So we've done the distribution of income. That was one of the steps. We also, in a really interesting paper that John and Nick Morris and Mick Keane and I published in the Scandinavian Journal of Economics in about 1984, I think we cracked conceptually how to do the incidence of taxes that aren't direct taxes on individuals. So what the incidence of company taxes and capital taxes. I think we cracked that. We just didn't get around to the practical implementation, which would have required allocating those non-household taxes to individuals. And the basic idea here is that the only thing that can pay a tax is a person. Ultimately, all taxes are taxes on people. They may formally be paid by entities other than people, but it's only people in the end that matter. So if you're taxing a company, for example, you must be making either the shareholders or the employees or the consumers worse off. You know, there's nobody else, and it is all people. So we should have cracked that. What we didn't crack, because it's really hard, is how to value consumption from durables, and that's especially housing, unbelievably important, and how to value consumption as a result of public sector spending. We just didn't get there, and that's to our great discredit. But there is always the Office for National Statistics. And two institutions I've been part of, the IFS and the ONS, both wonderful things. So the Office for National Statistics, for many, many decades, has published an annual document called The Effect of Taxes and Benefits on Household Incomes. And it's not perfect, it's not complete, it's not entirely conceptually coherent. It doesn't tackle taxes paid directly by companies or capital taxes, and it doesn't tackle public goods. So it doesn't have any attempt to answer the question, how should we think about defense or the police forces or the justice system or our road lighting networks, but it does tackle essentially the private bit, the health and education bit, and it tells us some very interesting things. So what do we mean by living standards? There are 5 stages in the ONS piece of work. The first is original income. So this is wages and salaries, investment incomes, pensions, private pensions. So you see that average is close to 50,000 per household in the UK. Then there's something called gross income, which is what happens when you add social security benefits from the state. So you add the state pension, you add child benefits, you add unemployment benefits. And then there's disposable income, which is what happens when you then take away direct taxes. And essentially the distributions I showed you at the beginning, and the way that we almost always think about living standards, is this bar here. Then there's a 4th stage, post-tax income, at which point you take off indirect taxes, so VAT and taxes on you add the imputed value of that part of public spending that is in this. So essentially, I think that the line I'm trying to run is that this is much closer to living standards than this, but this is what we all talk about when we're talking about living standards. And I say this is closer to because it's still missing out very important things that I hope you and all your brilliant colleagues will work on over the next 20 years. But it's big, and you can see that even eyeballing, you see the jump from original income, so wage than the social security system on which we rightly pay, we give great attention. Those were for the population as a whole. What about the poorest 20% of our society? Well, for the poorest 20%, all of these things are accentuated. So original income is not very high. It's a bit less than £9,000 in 2022. The increase from social security benefits is, as you would expect, quite significant. The impact of direct taxes is quite small because we have a progressive tax system and many people in the poorest 20% of the income distribution aren't paying any income tax national insurance. They do pay quite a lot of indirect taxes, but look at the impact of the healthcare system and the education system and our social care system and free childcare. I mean, it's extraordinarily large and much bigger than the thing that we spend endless amounts of political, parliamentary and research time on, the social security system. That's important, but these are much more important. This is the second quintile, so the people in the from 20% to 40% of the income distribution. It's a similar pattern, but yet again, the impact of these elements of public spending are much greater than the impact of the social security system on them. Zip through all of the rest. That's all 5 quintiles, and you can see that for the top quintile, the quintile in blue there, there is still a non-zero benefit from the healthcare system and the education system, but of course there is. That's what we want there to be, and it's actually similar in scale to the impact of benefits, because of course there are some people in the top quintile who are receiving the state retirement pension. But I don't see how you can say that this way of thinking about it isn't at least an important addendum to the way that we typically think about it. Think about the state, this just shows you the scale of the stages of redistribution. So what difference at each quintile, first of all adding social security benefits, then taking away taxes, direct taxes, then indirect taxes, then adding these elements creates. And you can see that that last set of 5 bars is very large. At that point, there is a big shift between the 4th set and the 5th set. I think an easier way of seeing that is just to look at the jumps in each case. So on the left, the changes in the position for each of the quintiles from paying cash benefits. Then the changes in position from direct taxes, and you see how very large the direct tax payment of those in the top 20% is relative to everybody else, and that's because their incomes are much higher. Then the impact of indirect taxes, and then finally the impact of what we're talking about here. About half of what I think we should be adding in, because this, again, let me emphasize, is ignoring all of the genuine collective public goods. But it's massive, and yet we hardly talk about it at all. This work done by the ONS, brilliant piece of work, not yet perfect, missing out some things that are very important, understates the true scale of the effect that I'm talking about. Now, all of this is not only an error, but in my view, it really affects decision-making. We're very good as individuals at making decisions about how to allocate the resources that we control directly. So, for example, this is what's happened to the share of our consumption that is related to food over the last, well, since 1964. It's massively fallen. We've got better off. On average, food prices have grown less quickly than other things. So we've spent less on it. That hasn't required particular government policy or collective action. It's just the result of individual choices that we individually make. We're really, really good at that. Or look at transport, which has gone in exactly the other way. As we've got richer, we've decided we want to move around some more. Transport's gone from less than 3% to 12% of our expenditure. that's happened through lots of individual actions. It's much, much harder collectively. And we'll only be able to do it properly collectively if we're doing together. This is what's happened as a share of GDP to our spending on health and education since the mid-1950s. Health is blue, education is brown. So healthcare expenditure has increased very significantly from about 3% to, depending exactly how you measure it, 8, 9, 10%. I want to say two things about that. The first is I think that's almost certainly a good thing. The second is I think that on any intelligent description of what's happened to our living standards, that must mean, unless the health service has been destroying value, that must mean an increase in our living standards. Now, of course, it's complicated because part of the reason that it's gone up is there are many more old people needing health care. But the reason we have a healthcare system is to allow people to have flourishing lives and to look after them when they're well. So surely that's a good thing. Certainly it's something that we wanted. But there's something I find really chilling, and it's probably the single number that makes me most unhappy, and that's what's happened to education spending. Look at 1975-6. In 1975-6, education spending is nearly 6% of GDP. Now, it's about 4.3, 4.2% of GDP. Over a period when our GDP has massively transformed in real terms, probably trebled in real terms in that period, we've reduced the share of GDP that we allocate to education. Well, bear with me for a moment. There's a concept in economics called the income elasticity of demand. And if it's more than one, we call it a luxury good, something that we expect people to want to spend more on as they get richer. Well, what do we think about education? I mean, is it possible to think that education might be a good which, as we get richer, we want to spend less on as a society, as individuals? I mean, what the is going on here? We've reduced by more than a quarter the share of the economy that we allocate to education since 1975-6. Well, it might be that's what everybody wanted to do, that was the objectives of all political parties and of the electorate as a whole. I don't think so. I think that's happened. Well, it's happened for all sorts of reasons. It's partly happened because of the pressure from healthcare. But it's mainly happened, I think, because we just don't have a coherent way of thinking about the consumption value, the living standard value of these aspects of what we're doing. And that's as true in a country where these are being provided privately as is in a country where they're provided publicly. It happens to be the case that these things are publicly provided in the UK, but this challenge of working out how we consider these things is just as big for countries where they are being provided privately. This is not a left-right debate. So my feeling is that this is really, really crucial, that this problem is another example of the common effect that we end up thinking about bastardizations of economics, that we narrow down views well beyond what a rational economist would think. No rational economist would ever say, oh, we should equate living standards to post-tax disposable income. But that's somehow where we've ended up with a debate that does that, and I think that does us enormous damage. Getting this right is hard and will force us to think about all kinds of things, including, critically, for the discussion today, intergenerational issues. Do we want to say that the value of pooling the risk of healthcare is at its highest for old people when they're consuming the healthcare, or should we think of it conceptually as being equally spread across the life course? Because if you've got a system when you're 18 that promises that when you're 93 you will be looked after, is your well-being when you're 19 being increased, or is it only your well-being when you're 93? These are really hard questions to which I don't begin to have an answer, but we better sort them out. Do we think about the benefits of education as accruing only to either children or their parents when they're children, or are they benefits that we consume throughout our lives? Am I still benefiting from the education I was given in Swansea when I was 15? Well, of course I am, but how we work out how to think about that and how we then make that comparable with, capable of being integrated with the kinds of distributions I showed you at the beginning, that is extremely difficult. But if we don't do that, then we're not going to get the issues that we're talking about later on sorted out, because they will continue to be marginalized. They'll continue to be pushed to one side when the grown-ups are making a decision about the allocation of taxation, of public spending, and of overall well-being. So it's challenging, but it's a huge opportunity for thinking creatively, for brilliant research, for stuff that can improve the debate and policy, and in the end, the thing that we care about most, which is outcomes. Thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. There's an awful lot there to wrestle with. And to start that wrestling, I have with me Anna Vignoles, who, known to all of you, I think, the director of the League of Human Trust, former trustee of the Nuffield Foundation, professor of education both at Cambridge and at UCL, and member of the ESRC Council. I also have here Ravi Gurumurthy, chief executive of Nesta, who also leads the Behavioural Insights team, was governor of the Health Foundation, had many other roles in the UK and internationally. And what I'm going to ask them to do is a demanding thing to ask them to offer a critique of what Andrew has said, but to pick out from what he has said those challenges which we must wrestle with, and what are the pieces that we need to hold on to make sense of the choices that we need to make in future public policy. Can we go to Anna first?
Thank you.
Your thoughts?
Thank you very much. Well, it's lovely to be here, and thank you for a fascinating and, as always, insightful talk, Andrew. I was thinking about this, and when you're thinking about income distributions, you always have to go back to the greats that were obviously very busy back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, doing interesting things on income distributions. And the late, great Tony Atkinson, for example, was working on this issue and bemoaned the fact that actually we, back in the day, didn't think enough about distributional effects. He also noted that people like Hugh Dalton were making the same complaint back in the 1920s. So I wouldn't want to lose sight of the fact that actually we've made huge progress just by thinking about distribution. But of course, Andrew is absolutely right that how that distribution is measured is vitally important. And the IFS's work and his own over the last 25 years to help us do that has been fantastic. I think also, Andrew, you really illustrated the point here, which is that the different components of consumption matter hugely. For ease of terminology, Tony Atkinson referred to what you're talking about as extended income. So it's sort of market income, transfers, taxes, and then the value of public services. So I think thinking about extended income is undoubtedly a really important thing that we should be doing more of. But I also think that we need to think about the problems that happen when we think in those terms. And I think there are three problems, first of all, in just measuring it in that way. And then I'm going to come on to, very briefly, what I think it means for policy. So there are three problems. One you've touched on already: how do we value these things? It's tricky when there is not a market price for the value that you might put on some of these outputs. But I think it's a bit more worrying than that. We might try to put a value on them based on how much we spend on them. And therefore, we would, for example, in a world where we hold back real wages in health and education, technically reduce the per capita spend on education and health. What does that look like when we then stick it on the graph? Is that a gain or a loss? And certainly I'm confident that the change in the cost of that education and health does not equate to the change in the value of the goods that's being produced. So I think it's not an easy question about how we measure it. And that's obviously a research agenda for the next 20 years, so that's good. But my second point I think I'm more worried about, which actually is not really talking across you in this one, but it's something I've worried about for a long time, which is we keep making category errors in terms of the way that we think about government spending. So some types of government spending is not really consumption, it's investment. And education, for example, education spending, I would argue, is an investment. It's in spending now on the child to reap a return. Since anyone who's a parent in the room will know, most kids don't really appreciate the consumption value of education when they're going through it. You know, basically this is all about spending now for gains in the future. Now, how do we treat that when it comes to public spending? Because you could have a reduction in the inequality using your extended income measure, and it could be generated by, say, a progressive increase in government spending that's going to produce long-term gains, or it could be the same change in the distribution that's basically only going to result in current spending being higher. And those two things will end up in a very different place. And I think for education, that's particularly important, but I think also hard questions about health in that respect. And so then the third measurement issue is wealth. So how on earth do we think about housing in all of this? It's tricky, right? Because it is an asset for many, but not all, and certainly we don't really properly value housing, and it's in the calculations of consumption. And if you could pick one thing that's causing mayhem in our labour markets, in our social relations, in you know, how we form families, etc., it's housing. So I think that's a big issue. But assuming that we all agree that an extended income measure gives us better insight, how would we use that? What would that mean for policy? So I think the first thing I'm slightly nervous of is that we'd need to be really careful how we use these measures. Putting it crudely, you can't eat the insurance component of NHS, right? So what matters to the individual at the moment can very well be the disposable income that we saw there. However important the insurance component is, it's not the same thing. Valuable investment in education might be a fantastic thing for us to be doing. We should all be doing it. We should invest more government spending in education, get it back to that 6% of GDP that you. If we haven't done something about children living in poverty and the poor home environments that they're in, right? So I don't think it's quite as neat as to look at the total extended income and say, are we doing better or worse? What we're spending on makes a great deal of difference. And of course, there is a world where when you reduce disposable incomes at the bottom end of the distribution, you are actually causing an increase in government spending by necessity on some components. And I think that's also hard to think about when we only focus on extended income. And another example, you know, if you think about early years spending, there are two ways at the moment that people are thinking about early years places for people who are in work, and that's going to give us an entirely different distributional effect from bringing back Sure Start, focused on our poorest children, spend the same amount, but get that bottom fifth ready for school. Those, you know, two entirely different policies. But we'd have to be careful that whatever definition we're looking at in terms of extended income, that we can capture that nuance. And I think one of my questions for Andrew was also that in the slides that you show, essentially what you're concluding is that the distribution of extended income has become more equal compared to the distribution of disposable income. In other words, if we take extended income as our measure, we might be just a little bit more optimistic that we've seen genuine distribution. I think that's clear. Looking forward, I don't think we can assume that extended income will always have that pattern, right? You could imagine a world where if health needs amongst older people combined with the wealth of older generations being higher, actually starts to look as though you're having the opposite of that, and it's becoming less redistributive. So that's not a criticism of using extended income, but it is a warning that it's an empirical question, actually, as to what extended income distributions look like. But I think you're absolutely right. We do need to ask important questions about what would we do differently if we had a better understanding to make the society as we look forward somewhat different from where we're sitting at the moment. So thank you again for a great talk.
And there's a lot to pick up on there, but I'm going to go, as Andrew considers that, to Ravi for your thoughts.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I also thought it was an absolutely brilliant talk, and I'm not going to attempt to critique it apart from the dungarees and T-shirt dress sense in the 80s, which we can perhaps come back to. I think the first thought that I had was how significant a corrective this is. I think it's a huge shift in how we think about the issue, and it could have quite powerful consequences in terms of our public debate. So first of all, the sense of progress that you might see through those graphs, particularly if you factored in health spending, I think would reframe the debate about how pessimistic we should be about change and about our capacity to improve living standards. That in itself is important. But also, I think if we could actually find a metric that is sufficiently simple and reductive enough to land in public debate, it could really change the way politicians, the media, anchor their understanding. So I think the challenge here, as ever with any kind of multidimensional understanding of a problem like poverty or living standards, is how to balance the complexity with something simple enough to become a new anchor. I think the second thought I had was about, a metric that is useful, that the government can say this is how we're going to define our progress, would be very useful in terms of elite debate. But how does this translate into people's actual interactions with public services and their sort of consumer citizenship experience? And I thought one reflection I had actually from living in America was, okay, you end up paying your health insurance via your employer. When I got my CT scan done, I would then get a bill from my hospital with it costing $10,000, and of course that's taken care of by my hospital, but at least there is a drip feed of communication about the consumption that you are you're enjoying and benefiting from, even if you're not actually paying. Now, that doesn't tell the whole story, obviously, because you may be benefiting from something now, but for many, many years that you're paying for immediately. But I think, can we start to make people feel more aware of the benefits? I think is interesting, even with childcare entitlements as they expand, how do we actually make people aware of the kind of costs that they are avoiding? I think one way in which policymakers have done that in the past is actually through individual budgets, personalised budgets. I think there's a slight risk that you end up creating policy mechanisms that are more transparent and giving people more choice, which are actually then inefficient and are not necessarily the right way to do things. In some situations, I think they're excellent, but I wouldn't be dogmatic about that. The other thing that it made me think about was, how do we do deliberation and how do we do informal collective choices on these issues? So one of the things that I was most proud about recently that Nesta was involved in was working with IFS to try to get a tax calculator so that you can all choose what the size of the state should be and try to make some of these trade-offs. I do think that we ought to be thinking about how this debate is not something that just happens amongst elite circles, but how can you bring it back to local councils and local communities, and how can participative budgets actually grapple with these questions. I think just two final points. One was about the fact that for the bottom quintile, and in fact for the bottom 3 quintiles, they are significantly better off due to redistribution than without the state acting. And I think that fact is not one that is at all widely appreciated. And again, if you're sort of a social democrat who believes in all of that, you'd be thinking, how do I convey it much more strongly, particularly actually to the bottom quintile. The bottom quintile redistribution is incredibly stark, and yet how do people actually realise that? Probably not. One final thing, this question about value versus cost seems super important, and in some areas, services are far more valuable and intangibly valuable than they may cost. But we don't want to in some cases they may not be. So in education, there's not a great correlation, I think, in PISA studies between the amount a teacher is paid and the actual quality of teaching. So we need a quite subtle understanding of where cost and value intersect and where they do not. But fundamentally, I think this is such an important contribution but it requires a huge amount of work from many organisations, including government, to try and make it the new anchor.
So, Andrew, do you want to pick up on both Anna's points and how the strengths and weaknesses of using these measures for policy? And I think also on Ravi's point about public understanding of these measures and the pitfalls of how that also may be interpreted.
Yeah, so thank you to both of you. And actually, I think almost all of you say end up focusing on precisely this question of, are we trying to create a new number or a new understanding? And I think part of the reason that we are so focused on the simplistic single number, it's easy to grasp, and that's also the problem. And my own sense here is what both Anna and Ravi pointed to is the risks, but also the benefits. So Anna points quite rightly. So one of the risks is, healthcare and education for your children's great, but not if you can't keep them warm enough in the winter or buy them a decent diet. So the parts of our overall consumption are not all of equal value. And the first thing that we have to make sure, well, who knows whether the first thing is healthcare or eating, although but, you know, they're not all comparable. And so a single number's never going to do it. And I have a particular abhorrence of composite indices. And the thing about disposable income is it's not a very composite index. They're all the money's just money. Once we broaden it out, it is more complicated, and then we get absolutely to some of the points that Ravi also made about, well, can we find something that's a simple enough way of describing this that isn't risking doing damage and creating policy difficulty? And I think so I think the things that both Ravi and Anna raised, these are enormous challenges for you all. I'm retiring in 3 months, so it's not my problem. It's they are big challenges, and I think the central part of that is that what we seek to do as individuals, what we seek to do as a collective, either through private collective action or state action, is not simple. There isn't just a simple way of describing what's going on. We say it's human flourishing, but that's true, but also trite. It comes down to what you actually do. And so these challenges of working out how we can answer questions about how you calculate this, but then how can we transmit them, communicate them, they're big. But at the moment, I think that we've said to ourselves, they're so complicated, we'll pretend they're not there. And that's just not good enough, and has given us a skewed understanding of what's going on and what the opportunities are.
I just want to pick up one point, Andrew, and ask you, which is, as one tries to frame this argument in years to come, how far will the ageing demography of the UK mean that essentially the argument will always be dominated by an extra rise of healthcare as a proportion of these public goods?
So I think if we're not careful, enormously. Because part of the reason for pointing all of this out is it's going to look as though living standards, as we've historically considered them, are likely to fall over the next 20 years. Because unless the economy grows unbelievably quickly, health is going to... I suspect that the likelihood is that health is going to consume an extra between 3 and 4% of GDP. Really is a lot. And so if we're stuck with the old-fashioned version, then we're going to think living standards are falling. I think it is the case that health is going to dominate. And so if we're to have sensible discussions about the justice system, the education system, social care, all the other things that we do together, whether we do them privately or through the state, we have to have the broader understanding of what's going on. Otherwise, health will just dominate everything.